Warpugs, the field of horror is broad, but there's no better setting than 40K. I can tell you that some of the most just stories I've heard have come from Vox and the Void and others like him who have put these things into narration. But there is one 40K horror story that up until now I hadn't heard of, and that is the King of Pigs. And this we're going to hear about from WesHammer. Now, WesHammer is going to be telling us about... He basically has a series called Grimdark Story Hour, which, if you're going to put a horror... If you're going to make a horror story, 40K is a great place for it. This was requested by Hyperion. We're going to jump right into this. Guys, you know all the WesHammer's links are in the description down below. Please check them out. I cannot wait for... I'm hoping this weekend, on Friday, I believe, I'm going to be releasing the next 5-ish minute lore, which is on the Officio. And I'm already midway through the next script. It feels good to be working on lore again. It feels really good to be working on lore again. Warpugs, let's jump right into this. The King of Pigs is horrifying.
The King of Pigs was a Warhammer horror story written by J.H. Archer and published to Black Library originally as a standalone title in 2022 as part of Black Library's Horror Week, before later being collected in the Warhammer Horror Anthology Resting Places. The story itself is presented as a series of journal entries collected in a diary that was recovered from the ruins of Hive Black Bracken, one of the many hive cities destroyed during a chaos uprising that spread across the entire planet, killing untold billions. Based on the journal's contents, the Imperial scribes that are now in possession of it believe that it must have originally been owned by one of the civilian workers, an unnamed author who worked in one of the Hive's many slaughterhouses, processing hogs in order to feed the armies of the Imperium. And considering that the final entry in this journal was written on the day of the Hive's downfall, by examining its contents, the scribes may be able to glean some insight into what exactly happened. But something's not quite right about these journal entries, and as time goes on, they keep getting stranger and stranger. It's full of delusional ramblings and demented hallucinations.
Yay.
The author was a deeply troubled man with a tragic past, and something ancient and evil was beginning to worm its way inside of his mind. Honestly, the less you know up front, the better. It's best to go into this particular story completely blind. And I'm not gonna lie to you, it is a bit more of a slow burn style horror tale.
I love
which
those.
Personally is my favorite kind of spooky story. Slowly ramping up the creep factor over time, and then finishing with an absolutely explosive and dreadfully disturbing ending. As much as I have fun doing all of the voices whenever I tell these spooky stories, I knew I couldn't do the main character of this story justice. So I reached out to the amazingly talented Chris Tester of the channel Naturally RP Voiceover here on YouTube.
There we
go. The man who, by the way, voiced one of my favorite lords in Total War Warhammer, Lockyer Fellheart. And I just gotta say, my man absolutely knocked it out of the park. And if you're not subscribed to his channel yet, you absolutely have to check him out. His voice is absolutely perfect for Warhammer, and he's got tons of interesting videos on his channel where he recreates some of 40K's most famous speeches, and some about actually doing voiceover work and his first-hand experience in the industry. I don't ask for favors very often, but do me a solid here, show our fellow Warhammer nerds some love and go sub to his channel.
Sounds like a plan.
I very rarely do this with my videos, as if you're somebody who's watching something about Warhammer 40K, you're probably aware of just how dark the franchise can be, and you know what you're getting into.
Yes.
But with this particular story, it's gonna touch on some topics of self-harm, a character's thoughts of unaliving themselves, and the death of a child. So if those are things that you're not...
If those processes bother you, don't even listen to the next lore video I put out after the intro to the Assassin Norm on the Vindicar.
Super comfortable with and don't want to get into right now, totally understand. I'll catch you in the next one. As always, support the original publication.
Of course.
The Warhammer horror books are my favorite in the entire franchise, and they don't get nearly enough love and attention.
No, they don't.
So come with me, my friends, as we examine the contents of a bloodstained journal extracted from a dead hive city. Let's dive headfirst into the grimdark. But before we get into all that, I wanted to take a minute to tell you about these super dope t-shirts that you see me wearing in all of my videos. They're made by this awesome company called Into the AM, and in my opinion, they make some of the best graphic tees that you can get on the internet. I'm personally a huge fan of them, and I wear their shirts just about every single day. And not just because they look ridiculously amazing, but with their awesome graphics that are colorful, creative, and in my opinion, downright beautiful. But they also manage to ride that middle line, where they're not only bombastic and loud, but also artistic and classy. Most importantly, they fit better than pretty much any t-shirts that I've ever owned, and they're also shrink and fade resistant. I love these things so much that I may or may not be secretly working on a collaboration with them behind the scenes.
Very nice.
But that's all on the hush-hush for now.
Very
if
nice.
If you want to pick up some of these amazing shirts for yourself, but also want to save a bit of money, then you can take advantage of Into the AM's custom pack deals, where you can pick and choose any shirts that you want and bundle them together to save big. They have a lot of different types of packs that you can make, whether you're into graphic tees, their more casual basic tees, polos, tanks, button-ups, or even underwear. You can get a pack of 3 graphic tees for only $61.95, or 6 graphic tees for $114.95.
That's actually pretty good. That's actually really, really good.
Then if you want to save even more money, you can use my code WesHammer at checkout to save an additional 10% off your entire order, which combined brings the total to less than 20 bucks a shirt. Go to intotheam.com today, or use the link in the description of this video and use code WesHammer at checkout to save big on some amazing t-shirts. Big thanks to Into the AM for sponsoring this video.
Garrett jumped into the mincer today. I saw it on my way to first break. Him, dangling a foot off the blood-slicked walkway, suspended over the hog blades like one of those dancing girls from the lower hive.
We're
Almost
into it.
playful. Just waiting for the opportunity to really make it count. Not that I realized it at the time. I called out to him. "Garrett, what in Throne's name are you doing?" But he didn't respond. "Overseer Bandon is just down the hall. Get back to it, you mechhead." I could tell he heard me as he turned to look, his eyes wide and wild. And what I saw was nothing. Just a man blinded by adrenaline, by fear, by pure thrill.
Yeah, we're already knee deep.
That's when I realized what he was doing. He dropped, feet first, straight as a glucose stick, arms crossed like one of the martyrs in the glass you see in chapels, straight into the blades. The thing is, the gears are only meant for the softer flesh of the lab hogs, so it took time for the mincer to get through the gristle and bone of his legs and lower torso.
Oh, that's bad.
More time than I think he was expecting.
Really?
The look on his face. Throne! They never stop production, even to clean out the machine. Can't risk productivity, what with a war on and all.
It has been several weeks since the author managed to get a good night's sleep. The tragedy at the processing facility a week prior certainly playing a role in his restlessness.
Yeah.
But not as much as one who doesn't work in one of the Hive City's many abattoirs may think. Spending every day of your life slaughtering pigs to feed the armies of the Imperium and the trillions of hungry hive dwellers within Black Bracken tends to take its toll on you and make you numb to spectacles of gore. More so, it is the constant sound of shellfire in the distance that keeps him awake night after night, growing louder and closer each and every day. War had come to this world, but from where it came was unknown. Whether it arose from within, festering like a cancer before enough deluded individuals had gathered together and gained enough strength to challenge the system that locked them down as cogs in the never-ending grinding machine that was the Imperium, or if it had come from the stars, an enemy of unknown strength and origin that sought to bleed the God Emperor's kingdom. Wherever the war came from was irrelevant. It was here, and the reports on the Hivecast and info links never gave any specifics. The messages from the commissariat only regurgitated the same reports over and over, that the war was going well and the enemies of mankind soon to be defeated. That each and every citizen must continue on in their duty to the Emperor,
Yes.
and their service and their chosen occupation. The cast always ended with a particularly uplifting sermon handed down by the ecclesiarchy themselves. But by this point, most of the population had started to grow numb to them, and paranoia was beginning to take root in the hearts and minds of the masses. For the
This can happen. This can happen when you have enough stress over enough time. if you don't manage the population well, you wind up having complications, so we say.
The humble workers, however, it mattered not. There was still work to be done, and as of right now, the fighting was still far away. The author's constant tossing and turning was keeping his partner Adder awake, who eventually sent him out to sleep in the kitchen on a bedroll. After relocating, and before attempting to sleep again, the author downed a few gulps of Amasec to steady his nerves.
Good man.
Even if the higher-ups refused to acknowledge it, the war that had once seemed so distant was slowly but surely drawing closer and closer. Whispers had begun swirling around the hab block that him and his partner lived in, that the hive cities in the north were on their last line of defense, that they would fall any day now, and that the enemy would begin to march on Black Bracken. Day 4943. The author takes the same route to work each and every day, one that can only be traversed by boat across a polluted river of sewage.
Yay.
3 miles there and 3 miles back. Slow, strong strokes of his paddle propel his craft through the muck and sludge as all manner of bloated organic material bounces gently in the river, thudding softly against his boat.
Nah.
He does his best to ignore them, keeping his eyes fixed straight ahead. It's a process he has done thousands of times before, but the one element of the trip he can't ignore, the one that always gets to him no matter how used to it he should be by now, is the overpowering stench of blood the closer he gets to the processing plant. Sometimes he tries to shut it out. Sometimes he tries to think of happier days, a time before the war, where him and his spouse Adder and his daughter were all together, a time where he was actually happy. Always he thinks of her, even though it's been years since she passed away. Her memory is still alive in his mind, the memory being one of the only things he has left to cling to in these terrible times, acting as his buoy, his anchor of sanity. He closes his eyes and remembers the little things that he didn't appreciate enough back then, like the happy pitter-patter sound of a child's feet running across a hab kitchen, the squealing and giggling, Sal jumping into both him and Adder's loving embrace, her adorable snoring that kept them both awake at night, and even the times they had to huddle together for warmth in Black Bracken's long, cold winters. They never had much. Him and Adder still didn't have much, but back then, they had each other, and even if he didn't realize it at the time, that was more than enough. But that was a long time ago. Now, only the fleeting memory of happiness was all he had left. Reality slowly fades back in, and the sound of laughter and gleeful squealing is replaced with the harsh reality of the abattoir's grinding, whirring mincers and the tortured squeals of dying pigs. Inside of the abattoir, the scent of blood was overwhelming, and it didn't matter how thorough the cleaning crews were each night, that irony tang was impossible to remove. It had seeped into the wooden floorboards, permanently staining them crimson. And wooden floors, admittedly, being something of a rarity in the Hive City, as all of the manufacturers had done away with them years ago.
Where did you get wood, my guy? Like, where did you get that to put? Like, I am actually really surprised that in a Hive City, actual organic wood would be put in a manufactorum floor. That is a rarity, to say the least. Most times in a Hive City, you're not going to see wood on floors at all. You're going to only see it in the upper spires in someone's home.
They were a fire hazard. Fires were bad for productivity. And in the factories of Black Bracken, productivity was all that mattered. This facility specialized in the slaughter of a particular species of genetically augmented hogs. They had been designed to rapidly grow to maturity in only a couple of weeks within these synthetic gestation sacs before being harvested. Only a fourth of the pigs that the facility produced actually went to feed the hive's population, the rest being shipped off-world to feed the Imperium's countless armies across the stars. It is the author's job to mindlessly put bolts through the pigs' unsuspecting heads as they are delivered to his station via conveyor belt. It may not be as heroic or inspiring as fighting on the front lines, but he tells himself that it's still important work. Despite its grim nature, the abattoir is a well-oiled machine. The workers turn up, take an anti-bac shower, throw on their overalls, punch in their work codes, and stay in the same killing booth for 12 hours every day.
Oh my
The pay
God.
was only enough to get by, but more importantly, the workers were also provided rations as additional compensation to feed themselves and their families.
Hey, there you go.
The author's lack of sleep has had a negative impact on his performance. He's been late to work multiple times over the last month, and on this day, his exhaustion caused him to drift off inside of the anti-bac shower. The burning chemical sensation in his eyes being what ultimately snapped him back out of his fatigued state. By the time he made it to his workstation, Overseer Bandon was there waiting for him with a twisted smile painted across his face.
Of course.
Bandon was a cruel wretch of a man that took a perverse delight in discipline, and seeing as how the mishaps in the shower had caused the author to be several seconds late for his shift, he was all too happy to cut his rations as punishment.
Of course.
12 hours and several hundred dead pigs later, his shift had finally ended. He visited a small decrepit chapel that was located on the outskirts of the facility. The church didn't get many visitors nowadays, and the smell of pigs drove most people who lived in the area away. But he liked it. He appreciated it for what it was, and more importantly, after spending 12 hours in that grim meat factory with nothing to listen to aside from the death screams of countless animals and the constant whirring and grinding of mincers, the quiet was an all too welcome blessing. He lit a candle and issued a silent prayer to the Emperor to protect the hive and all of the civilians within it. But the only thing he hears back is silence, and he wonders if the Emperor had forgotten them. Almost as nearly as the thought entered his mind, he is overwhelmed by the shock of the heresy he just committed. Of course the Emperor hadn't forgotten them. The Emperor was a living god, the one true divinity of the universe, the master of mankind. Of course he would protect them. To doubt that even for a moment was tantamount to heresy.
Yep.
He rushed home and purged himself of his blasphemy by lighting his oven and pressing and holding the back of his hand to the hot burner for 5 seconds.
It might sound extreme, but flagellation, which is the inflicting self-harm in a religious sense, goes all the way back to the early days and up until the late Middle Ages of Christendom. And it is in several other religions as well. Causing self-harm to purge sinful thoughts. Yep.
Searing pain was intense, but it did momentarily take his thoughts away from his hunger and exhaustion. Despite his best attempts to stifle his cries, Adder heard him whimper and rushed into the kitchen. The author dismissed him, told him that it was nothing, and tries to wave him away, claiming the injury had happened at work. His concerned spouse tries to help, reaching out to clean the wound, but he wouldn't let him touch him. He knew in his heart that Adder knew he did it to himself, and when he looked in the eyes of the man he had vowed to love for all time in front of their friends and family so long ago, he couldn't read his emotions. Was it sympathy or disgust? His restlessness was as bad this night as it had been since the shelling began. In those rare fleeting moments where his body actually lets him rest, all the author can dream of is the screams of dying pigs.
I visit the chapel every day now, without fail. In the darkness, the sound of the shell fire gets closer and closer, and I can hear the marching of troops heading to the outer walls. I close my eyes and dream of Sal and of Adar, back when there was softness between us. Long gone now. I pray for another child, but again our letters of adoption are rejected. With a war on, there's no chance. The ministorum is too busy, even though the orphanages are more packed than ever. I feel so much anger. I yearn for guidance from the Emperor, but there is still only silence. The same silence, day in, day out. I feel like I'm stuck on a conveyor belt. I still cannot sleep.
He was late again the next day, and the overseer was there waiting for him, smiling and flashing his steel replacement teeth at him. As punishment, he felt it appropriate to put him on half rations, even though he was already on half rations.
Yeah.
And he warns him that if he's late one more time, he'd be making the commissariat aware of the situation. There was nothing he could do, so he slowly trudged his way along to his station, clenching his teeth and holding his breath as to not let his thoughts leak out of his mouth and cause any more trouble. At one point, he glances over to the mincer and thinks back to the man who had jumped into it. He thinks to himself that Garrett's mistake was jumping in feet first, and he wonders if diving in head first would be quicker.
Oh,
Maybe
God.
he could take the overseer with him. It would only take a minute. It would be quick, and maybe his worthless life would actually mean something if he made it to the front lines as a sausage to feed a hungry soldier. But more importantly, he would be back with her. He would see Sal again. He dismisses the idea, but he's never quite able to shake it off entirely. The dark thought always lingering in the back of his mind, an escape route if he lacks the strength to continue on. Perhaps there was a sense of comfort in that, or at least control. He goes...
Guys, as someone who has been through a decent amount in my life, and as someone who... This story is starting to hit me in a certain kind of way, because for a period of time in my life, I couldn't stop having thoughts. I had them a lot. If you or someone that you know begins having thoughts like this, it's not the time to judge them. It's not the time to do anything else other than be there for them and to try to encourage them to seek out help. Because that is a dark, dark place to be in. And I have been there. And it's a place that you want that it's bad when your own mind is torturing you. And quite frankly, I am glad that I had certain people around me that I did not wind up going through things by myself. Eventually. For a while there, I was by myself. And then all of a sudden, we pretty much got found out. Yes. Don't go through this kind of crap alone.
Through his entire shift, almost like he's floating 5 feet out of his own body, just watching him go through the motions. Pig, bolt, remove bolt, move carcass. Pig, bolt, remove bolt, move carcass. Pig, bolt, remove bolt, move carcass. The day carried on like this for 12 hours, and there was about 10 minutes left in his shift when something strange happened. The next pig that came down the conveyor belt was much smaller than all the others. It was young, a piglet, just a child. There must have been some kind of error.
Oh, no.
A hog had been sent down the line that was not ready to be harvested. He had heard of similar things happening before to other workers, but most of the time when a piglet was sent down the line, it was always freakishly malformed. Something had gone wrong in its development, and thus it had been harvested early. A mercy killing.
Right.
But this pig was different. It was pristine, almost beautiful. It didn't seem like all of the other hogs that came down the conveyor belt. Maybe he was reading into something that wasn't there, but he felt that the other pigs always looked defeated, like they somehow knew that there was no escape and had accepted their grim fate.
Oh, no.
There was life in this small piglet, and he could tell that it wanted to live. He didn't know what to do. He looked around. His shift was close to ending, and if the conveyor belt didn't start moving again, soon the overseer would be notified, and there would be trouble. He was on thin ice as it was, so he did what he had to do. He didn't want to. He certainly wanted to notify somebody that there had been a mistake, but there was no time. He loaded the bolt, pressed the pneumatic gun to the piglet's forehead, looked away, and fired. His hand suddenly felt wet, but it wasn't blood that had splashed back against him. The piglet was licking his hand, right between his knuckles. It was a miracle. The gun had jammed. The conveyor belt stopped, as it always did whenever there was some kind of machine failure, and he knew that he only had a few minutes before the mechanic arrived to fix it. The piglet looked at him with these childlike auburn eyes, ones that looked impossibly familiar, like he had seen them before a long time ago. Later on, he would swear that it was just a combination of the exhaustion, the stress, and the hunger. But in that moment, he swore that those eyes recognized him too. He couldn't let the piglet be killed, but if they found him with it in his arms, they would accuse him of stealing. Stealing from the corporation that feeds you is one thing, but stealing food during wartime is nothing short of treason. They wouldn't just cut his rations again. He would be executed. Without thinking, he scooped the piglet up and put it in a crawl space underneath his workstation, just in time for the mechanic to arrive. He didn't seem to notice anything and went about his work, and after he had finished, the conveyor belt started back up, bringing the next dejected hog to his station. After the mechanic had left, he reached down into the darkness of the crawl space, feeling around, until he felt the piglet's tongue lapping at his hand once again. After he met that pig, something fundamentally changed within the author's soul. He felt renewed, invigorated, like his life suddenly had purpose again. And most importantly, he was finally, mercifully able to sleep again. It was marvelous. He slept harder and deeper than he figured he had slept in his entire life. It had been so long since he had an actual session of rejuvenating sleep that he had completely forgotten what it was supposed to feel like. More than just the blessing of real sleep, though, that piglet had ignited an emotion in his heart he hadn't felt in what felt like forever: hope.
And then this is all gonna turn into abject hell. It always gets better before it gets a lot worse.
The feeling of hope was such a small, fragile thing, like a new seedling in a vast, dead garden. When he dreamed of the piglet hiding under the crawl space. It was a new life. The Emperor had heard his prayers, and impossibly, and almost comically, had sent his blessing in the form of a tiny baby pig. Over the next several days, he would end up waking up early and have breakfast with his husband, a ritual that he had given up on shortly after the shelling began. He made sure to save some of the carb cakes for the piglet and would set off for the river, rowing across it faster and more determined than he had in years, unfortunately causing the burn wound on his hand that had begun to scab over to reopen each and every day. But he didn't care. The pain kept him focused. He had a sense of purpose once again.
Oh boy.
He started showing up for work 40 minutes early and would greet the grumbling
40
overseer
minutes?
with the pleasant smile of an innocent man. Though, admittedly, every time he got to his workstation, a sense of dread would wash over him. What if somebody had discovered the piglet? What if its squeals had alerted someone to its presence?
This is gonna get really bad really fast. 1 second. All right, let's hop back in.
What would happen to him if they found out he was hoarding rations? That primal dread dissipating as he reached down into the darkness of the crawl space and felt the piglet's tongue licking at his hand in greeting, and more importantly, in anticipation of breakfast. It continued on this way for about half a week, and slowly but surely, the restless nights began to return, the pleasant dreams of the piglet being replaced with an awful memory, one that his mind refused to let him forget. Every night, he was forced to relive that terrible day. She had gotten sick with what the hive dwellers called parchment fever. The illness was debilitating and very painful, but only rarely developed life-threatening complications. Her fever had seemed like it was breaking, that the worst of it was behind them. Adder had already left for his shift, and the author had sworn to him that he would stay by her side, that he wouldn't let anything happen. He cooked for her, he read to her, and when the pain got to be too much, he would help her to an old aluminum bathtub filled with the coldest water he could find. He lowered her tiny body in and comforted her as the cooling water washed over her, bringing with it much-needed relief and taking the pain away. It was this moment, holding her hand in the tub, comforting her as they rode out the last of the fever together before she would start feeling better. That was the last time he remembered being happy. That's when the call came. It was Overseer Bandon telling him that he needed to come in. There had been a terrible accident, and the man in the booth next to him got both of his arms ripped off while unjamming the mincer. The author told him that he had a 2-day pass, that he had promised to stay home with his sick daughter. But Bandon was relentless and threatening. He told himself he didn't have a choice, and it was true, they needed the money. So he tucked his little girl into bed and headed off to the river. He completed his shift and headed home, But when he got back, he found the municipal corpsman outside of his door, an adder weeping on the floor, clutching Sal in his arms and begging her to breathe. Despite the trauma of having to relive this terrible day every night, the silver lining for him was that here in his dreams, he could see her again. He could see her face again, clear as day, just as she was the day before she passed. And over time, as the dream played out over and over, night after night, her face slowly began to change. Each night, beginning to look more and more like the face of a pig. Day 4,981. It was on this day that the first shells hit the hive. The enemy was still far off in the distance, but this was the first sign that they were coming, that it was inevitable that war would come to Black Bracken. Panicked rumors began to spread around the hive, many people claiming that they saw the young officers that would routinely stop in the communal caffeine houses, that they looked pale, sickly, like they were deathly afraid of something, and would only speak in whispers. Yet the voices on the Voxcast spouted the same messages as before, that everything was under control, to trust in the Emperor to guide his flock through these troubled times. Under normal circumstances, the author would secretly have appreciated the idea of a shell hitting the abattoir. Sure, his job would be gone, but it would mean no more back showers, no more menser, no more slaughtering pigs, and perhaps most joyously of all, no more Overseer Bandon. But things were different now. He had a new life to protect, hiding in the crawl space, and the thought of something happening to it was too much to bear. He had broken his promise before, and he would never make that mistake again. The workers continued on as normal. It didn't matter how bad the shelling got. They had a job to do and soldiers to feed. The building itself had yet to be hit by a shell, but the chapel outside was now nothing more than smoldering ruins.
That sucks.
All of the prayers that the author had made there, all of the devotion he had given, was now nothing more than ash. However, there was no time to mourn this symbolic destruction of his faith itself. There was another problem that was far more pressing on the author's mind.
Here we go.
The piglet was growing incredibly quickly, faster even than its gene-enhanced nature should have allowed.
Joyous.
At this point, it had grown large enough that it was pressing against each side of the small space, causing the sluice gate to bulge. He realized that this place wasn't safe anymore. He needed to think of something, and quickly, that the most important thing in the world was to keep it safe, that the piglet had to be protected.
The war has truly come. All day, all night, all I can hear is the thumping of cannon fire. I can feel it as much as I hear it, reverberating in my chest. Adar got caught up for recruitment yesterday. We didn't say much over dinner, but I could see the scabs where he'd begun biting his lips. Conscript Adar. Straight to the front for him, he said. Straight to the trench lines just inside the hive's outer wall.
Oh, God.
He's never been that far in his life. He's never even been beyond the district.
This is getting dark. This is getting dark fast.
I don't envy him. He promised me that he'd make it back, but I could tell it was more in an effort to convince himself.
Right.
He left this morning without saying goodbye.
Day 4,990. War finally came to Black Bracken in all its terrifying splendor, and with it came a shell that struck the author's hab building. The shockwave blew out the windows of his unit, and the thunderous boom of the impact caused his ears to be momentarily deafened. He heard the alarms blaring across the hive, and every breath he took filled his lungs with rockcrete dust. He stumbled out of his apartment and made his way through the debris out into the open air of the city. He wandered closer to where another habstack had been, and the familiar scent of blood filled his nostrils. He looked across the rubble that had once been homes, where families he was familiar with, his neighbors and friends, had lived. All he could see was meat. He had been through a traumatic event and had survived a shelling, but even still, he found it strange that the only thought lingering in his mind was how, whether it came from hogs or people, how all meat looked the same. Day 4,991.
Yeah, that's a red flag.
Without his spouse there to comfort him, the author's anxiety reaches a fever pitch, and when he slips in and out of dreams that are as vivid as if he was really there. The dreams of that terrible day so long ago being slowly replaced with something else, something peaceful. He sees flowers, a garden perhaps, an impossibly beautiful garden that stretches out in every direction, over hills and valleys, covering every inch of land in beautiful flowers. As he wanders through them, he can hear the sounds of tiny footsteps behind him and a child's laughter. But every time he turns around to look, he suddenly wakes up. It's the same dream every night, and he feels that it has to mean something. It was around the same time that he began dreaming of the garden that the flies arrived. The shelling had gotten worse, and the bodies were beginning to pile up in the street. Thick clouds of black flies, each the size of a human thumbnail, were everywhere, coating every surface of every building. The buzzing of their wings was near constant, and they sounded remarkably similar to the mincers and the abattoir. Even though at this point it had been several weeks since he injured it, the author noticed that his hand hadn't healed. It had gotten worse. In fact, it had now begun weeping a near constant thin layer of pus.
Oh,
Day 4992.
No, not Nurgle.
He couldn't wait any longer. The pig had now fully outgrown its space. He could hear it whimpering in pain as its sides rubbed against the confines of the crawl space. He had to do something. He had to get it out and back to his house without being seen. He worked throughout the day, reaching his hand down into the crawl space to comfort the pig and let it lick his hand every hour. Eventually, his shift came to an end, and he decided that now was the time. He had to make his move. He went into an old abandoned storeroom on the 4th level, and he swore for just a moment that he could hear a voice whispering to him, telling him that everything was going to be okay.
That's a bad sign.
It was safe, and it was time. He looked around for something that he could use, and eventually came across a wheeled container that was covered in dust. He tipped it over, dumping out all of its rusted contents. He then grabbed a tarp and wheeled the container back to his booth. The pig was sitting there waiting for him. It had broken free of the crawl space and was lying on the side of the wooden bloodstained floor. It was wheezing and panting. Its legs had completely atrophied, unable to support its massive bulk. He put it in the cart and covered it up with the tarp before wheeling it out of the workroom. He moved towards the back of the facility where no one would notice him slipping out. And even if they did, at this point, who would really care? Everyone in the Hive City knew that the end was near, that these were the final days. The author didn't care. Keeping the pig child safe was the only thing that mattered. He made it to the docks where his boat was and pulled the tarp off the container. He looked down at the fat, bloated creature, their eyes meeting for the first time since the day it came down the conveyor belt. He saw in its eyes a strange sense of understanding, almost like it knew what he was doing, that he was its protector. He knew that pigs were intelligent, but this was different. This was something more. He stood there for some time, just looking at it. It was pitiful. It couldn't stand up on its own, and its skin had been stained red by the constant dripping down of blood from the conveyor belt. It was as if for the first time since this all began, the author realized what he was doing, what he had committed to, and the idea that he somehow saw some kind of relation between this thing and his daughter made him sick to his stomach. The lack of sleep had clearly just made him delusional. That's when he saw it. Something growing out of the pig's belly, something pushing forcefully at its skin from deep inside. An impression began to form. It was a face. Clear as day, it was a face. A full set of teeth with 2 bloodshot eyes staring back up at him. The pig rolled onto its back, and from the horrible, terrible mouth in its side came a low, guttural laugh. And that's the last thing he remembered before blacking out. He dreamed of the garden, serenity and tranquility given form, a paradise that couldn't possibly exist. The horror of his day-to-day life, juxtaposed against such impossible beauty, was almost profound in its contrast. He had dreamed many times of the garden before, but this time it was different. He wasn't alone. There was an old man here, humming and tending to his flowers, tending to his children. He stared at him for a while, watching him work from behind, and eventually the old man seemed to have noticed that he was being watched, and slowly turned around to look at him. His face was old and wrinkled, but incredibly warm. It was the kindest, most gentle face he had ever seen. His gaze shifted down and saw that cradled in the old man's arms was a young girl. As their eyes met, Sal smiled back at her father. He sees nothing but benevolence in the old man's face, and although he is now aware that he is definitely dreaming, he doesn't want the dream to end. He wants
Chaos corruption comes in many forms, and the bad thing about the 40k universe is something like this can take hold of somebody. And the horrible thing is, you can see it happen. You could see something like this happen. This is getting bad. So we know now the city's under attack by Nurgle. The flies are an absolute dead giveaway. You knew it was some sort of chaotic force, but now we know it's Nurgle. And this is the dreams that he's having. I at first was kind of maybe Slanesh, but no, this is Nurgle's garden.
To be here,
the nice
forever,
version
in
of
this
it.
Wonderful, impossible place. He doesn't want to go back. He weeps, begging the Emperor to just let the dream continue for a little while longer. But the dream ends, and he wakes up in a pool of his own sweat, the taste of vomit in his mouth. He is in the grip of a terrible fever, and he has no idea how he got here, back in his own home. He didn't even know what day it was. His memory was still foggy. Everything seemed like a blur. It was as if the last several days were just an afterimage in his mind. He called out for his partner, his dry throat causing his voice to crack. Only silence answered back. Suddenly, he felt his hand erupt in searing pain, like he had plunged it directly in a pile of hot coals. But when he looked down, he didn't see any flames. The infection in his hand had gotten much worse and had begun to creep up his arm. That constant stream of leaking pus had turned black as oil. He screamed again for his husband, but again there was no reply. He stumbled out of bed, having to support himself by leaning on the wall. He needed a drink, something to calm his nerves. He started to shamble out towards the kitchen, and that's when he heard it. The familiar snuffling sound, and it was coming from his bathroom. He opened the door and saw the pig sitting in his aluminum tub, but it was just the pig. There was no disturbing face imprinted on its belly, no bloodshot eyes or the sounds of laughter. It was just a pig. Had the fever caused him to hallucinate the entire thing?
No.
He looked up at the clock hanging on his bathroom wall and noticed that his shift was scheduled to start in 4 hours. So he shuffled back to his room and went back to sleep.
The pestilence has ripped through my hab sector, and the bodies are now having to be burned en masse. Tony died yesterday, shitting himself to death on the south stairway. His body hasn't been taken down, and now he lies there, unblinking. There are too many corpses to move. The plane song is played non-stop over the loudhailers. I think they're trying to cover up the sounds of the dying and the burning. Around the corpse fires gather multitudes of civilians, as these are the only places where the flies don't congregate. The flies are constant now, and I can barely see the sewer water on my daily row as a twitching layer of the pests floats on the surface of the tributary like a veil.
Well, if Nurgle...
more than I'd like.
Day 4,994. Despite the catastrophe,
If there was ever a place for Nurgle to be, it'd be a hive city.
currently engulfing the city, the author, along with all of the other workers, made their way to the abattoir. Outside, the overseer was giving some kind of impassioned speech to all of them, a sermon that had been delivered that very morning from the upper hives. Nobody was listening to him. The crowd of workers looked completely defeated, a glazed look covering each and every one of their faces. Impending doom lingered in the air. Even the overseer didn't seem to be listening to the words coming out of his own mouth as he delivered line after line, whilst gently swaying back and forth on his podium, a half-finished bottle of Amasec clutched in his left hand.
Liquored up.
Over the next few days, the author's fever would continue to get worse and worse. He claimed that he felt like death all day and all night. Eventually, even the abattoir fell victim to the ongoing war, one of the shells striking the building, dealing a large amount of damage and killing half of the workforce, that drunkard of an overseer included. His body was so completely obliterated that they had to identify him by his steel teeth. Another stray shell struck a critically important power reservoir, and the entire subsector was plunged into darkness. Even still, the workers' duty was eternal, and those that had not been killed in the shelling were forced to come in, each of them being handed a large knife and instructed to kill and process the pigs by hand. Day 4,997. Several more days of intense shelling would follow, before eventually the enemy broke inside of the hive walls. The endless percussion of detonating shells, now accompanied by a constant tempo of las fire. At this point, the entries in the author's journal start to become a bit more erratic. He seems like he is becoming completely detached from reality. He continued to dream of the garden, the old man and his daughter's smiling face each and every night, and during his waking hours, the pig was the only thing he could focus on. A single thought running through his mind over and over: protect the pig, protect the pig, protect the pig at all costs. Dark whispers lingered in the back of his mind, growing stronger and more persistent every day. The voices told him that he needed to go and find food, that the pig was hungry. It was on the 4,998th day that the author received a divine vision. He had blacked out shortly after waking for his shift and found himself once again in the garden, feeling the soft touch of soil against his bare skin. The sound of birdsong in the air, and all of the pain of his infection replaced with that all too familiar, soothing calm this tranquil place seemed to generate. The old man was there again and reached out a hand to help him to his feet. The grip was firm and strong, more so than he had expected from a man of his age, but it was also comforting and protective. After he had gotten to his feet, the old man clasped both of his hands in his own. He smiled at him, and for the first time after he began to dream of this place, the old man spoke.
"You should stay here in my garden. It's all yours if you want it."
He pointed out towards a small ramshackle hut on the other side of a small patch of turf. The building looked like it was falling apart and seemed rather out of place.
"She's waiting in there. Go to her."
He made his way to the moss-covered hut. The wood was damp and rotten, and the door swung creakily on its hinges as he opened it. It was dark inside, but at the far end of the hut, he could make out what appeared to be an aluminum bathtub, strikingly similar to the one in his own home. An imminent feeling of dread filled his soul, and he found himself desperately afraid. Every last shred of sanity in his mind was telling him to run, not to look, and to go no further. But his body wouldn't obey him. He walked forward into the darkness and saw a small pair of pale hands reaching up and gripping the side of the tub. They were covered in weeping sores, and the fingernails were hanging off each finger. The figure sat up and stared at him. Her body was blue and swollen, and her eyes had been replaced with streams of squirming larvae and maggots. Her jaw began to open, impossibly wide, like a leprous, decomposing snake. What emerged from her rotting throat was not the sing-song voice she had had in life. It was a sound that he was all too familiar with. She squealed like a stuck hog. He came to, reality rushing back in like a violent tidal wave. He was standing in the abattoir, the other workers staring at him with a mixture of fear and disgust. The pain in his hand was back as well, but it had spread to both his left and his right. It felt like he had plunged them into a pot of molten metal. He finished his shift in silence and then rode home, the shellfire screaming its way across the sky as he traveled. He wondered how long it would be now, how long they all had left. He wondered if the Emperor would truly protect them. The final journal entry, day 4,999.
Joyous.
It was on this day that Adder had made his way back to their home. He was clad in his conscript uniform and looked incredibly sickly. He had suffered a debilitating puncture wound in his shoulder, and his entire right side was coated in dark blood. He barely made it over the threshold of their home before collapsing on the kitchen floor. He told the author in panicked, ragged breaths that they were here, that the enemy had finally come for them, and that they were just outside. He could hear the crack of gunfire and the frenzied screaming coming from every direction, while the swarm of flies battered against the windows. Adder pleaded with him to help him, but he couldn't move. He didn't want to. He had become numb to everything happening all around him, and he looked at the love of his life with a gaze that held nothing less than utter ambivalence. He grabbed a bottle of Amasec off the counter and handed it to his partner. Adder gulped it down, and then weepily told him that he didn't want to die. The author simply shrugged and told him that nobody did. Outside of their hab, they could hear footsteps coming up the stairwell and screaming as doors up and down the hall were being kicked in, followed by the boom of close-range fire. He sat down next to Adder, who pulled himself up and rested his head on the author's shoulder. He was sobbing, but he told him that at least they would get to see Sal again. That's when they heard it. Laughter. a child's laughter coming from the bathroom.
Oh no.
Adder's eyes went wide with fear. Without a word, the author calmly stood up and made his way to the bathroom. He opened the door and stared at the bloated abomination that had been the pig. It was swollen and leprous and had grown monstrous in size, its bulk spilling over the edges of the tub and its frame rising in height to the point it was cracking the ceiling. Its swollen, pallid belly was a swirling amalgamation of dozens of faces, toothy, rictus smiles, and tortured, grinning mouths, frantically and hopelessly pressing against the creature's flesh, as if desperately trying to break free of the joyous nightmare of their confinement. In the very center, he saw a man's face he recognized. It was Garrett, the man who had jumped into the mincer. Impossibly, and for the first time since this all began, the pig opened its mouth and spoke.
The grandfather waits for you in the garden. My grandfather demands an offering. A seed for the seed garden.
He knew what had to be done, and in that moment, the instant he subconsciously decided on his next course of action, the microsecond he committed to plant that seed for the pig, everything changed. The author's fever had reached a point that by all accounts should have killed him. If not from the sickness, then from the overwhelming pain that would have sent any living person into shock. Infection and sickness pulsed throughout his entire body. But the pain was gone, replaced with a terrible rush of pleasure. He went back out to the kitchen and dragged Adder to the bathroom.
Bye, Adder.
The terrified man knew what was about to happen, but he was too weak to stop it.
I gave him to the pig. As I stood in the front room, I could hear the footsteps getting closer. I listened to Addar's bones crunching. I realized then, deep in my gut, that this sacrifice wasn't enough. I moved over to the window and let in the flies. As I write, I am surrounded by them and feel as if my flesh is liberated.
No.
I must go to the garden myself, where Sal and I can be together again. I must meet the gardener himself. I must present myself to the pig. It sings to me. Death to the corpse emperor! Death to the corpse emperor! Death to the corpse!
Material recommended for immediate deletion. Please submit yourself to the commissariat for psychological and physical purification.
Well, war pugs? Yeah. This is why 40K is a nightmare zone. This is why 40K is an absolute horror story. Because stuff like this happens. And this guy was just another nameless victim. Just another nameless, just another statistic, just another line item on an administratum sheet. Just another sad story in a long history of sad stories. Just another one. Chaos, this is why chaos is the great enemy. Because it's insidious. And its influence can come in so many forms. People wonder why guard regiments turn. People wonder why things happen the way that they do when chaos presents itself. Like most things, chaos finds a single crack and it worms its way inside. Sentimentality. The urge to not be in pain. Simple attraction. These things are... They're so simple. They're so just outwardly simple in appearance, but they lead to such horrible things. War Pugs, this is why 40K is as amazing of a franchise and a, you know, like a whole universe and storyline as it is, because this was just a short story that had no greater impact on the wider war. It had no greater impact on the wider war that was being talked about. It had no greater impact on the subsector. Nothing like that. This was just a story of an everyday person experiencing what should never have to be experienced, and going through the horrors of basically existing during a siege of his home. The King of Pigs was not a story of a greater demon being born, or even the story of, you know, a person turning to chaos and fighting against, you know, turning on his beliefs and everything like that. This is just a story of a man, like any other person, who lost a child and then fell to chaos. They did not go on to lead any chaos army. They did not go on to do any, you know, any real thing. They just went into a bedroom, they went into a bathroom and fed themselves to a pig that they had saved and that had been corrupted by chaos itself. This is why 40K is such a rich storytelling environment. Because this story, even though it had no wide implications whatsoever, and there is no grand arcing overplot about it. It is just a story of a man finding a pig that for some reason reminded him of his daughter in some strange way, most likely influenced by Nurgle, and eventually going full bore into chaos, unintentionally, unwillingly, unwittingly. And people still wonder why guard regiments turn. People don't understand that this is something that can and will happen. And that's why Warhammer 40K has always been my favorite franchise of all time. Warpugs, WesHammer's links are going to be in the description down below. I highly recommend you subscribe to him. Subscribe to me if you haven't already. I'm going to have my links in the description down below as well. And I hope you guys have a great day. Yeah, this was really, really good. And really, really depressing.